Their research lay virtually untouched and unread, until Robert Proctor visited Jena in 1995. What he found in the university vaults made sobering reading.
We have a newspaper from the period. This is the official Nazi Party newspaper for Thuringia, and it talks about tobacco dangers will be researched. The Fuhrer, Adolf Hitler, has given 100,000 Reichsmark for a scientific institute in Jena.
And so, to the strains of Beethoven, the first centre for assessing the hazards of tobacco came into existence. The new team approached their task with typical thoroughness. The man in charge was a dedicated Nazi called Dr. Karl Astel. He was a member of the SS and head of racial affairs in Thuringia.
This is where a lot of the Reich's anti-tobacco research was performed. One can imagine these leaders of Nazi academia sitting around, and at one sitting deciding the fate of Jews, at another deciding the fate of tobacco in Germany. This is their backdrop.
The list of things the Institute recommended for healthy Aryans reads like a lifestyle magazine today. Bake whole grain bread, eat fresh fruit and vegetables, drink mineral water rather than beer, and take plenty of exercise. But Hitler's overriding health priority was preventing cancer among childbearing German women.
In the mid-1930s, you have the first public pictures showing women doing breast self-examination. This is really astounding because in America, women weren't even supposed to touch their own breasts in the 1950s, whereas in Germany, 20 years before, you already had a mass campaign to get women to do breast self-examination.
The citizens of Thuringia became part of an extensive cancer prevention experiment nearly 50 years ahead of its time. Smoking was banned on trams and trains and in many public places. Policemen on duty and pregnant women were forbidden from smoking altogether. To Hitler, smoking was decadent. Not smoking was one way to promote racial superiority.
Here's a telegram from Hitler himself, and he says, "I congratulate those of you who are working to free humanity from one of its most dangerous poisons," as he says, signed Adolf Hitler.
But outside Germany, Hitler and his anti-smoking schemes smacked of prohibition and dictatorship. His healthy lifestyle with Eva Braun was an object of ridicule.
By the way, did you know Hitler was in the corps de ballet? Evidently, Eva herself was surprised by the discovery.
When the war ended, the team leader, Dr. Astel, committed suicide to avoid retribution for war crimes. The other researchers just faded away. Being a scientist on one of Hitler's special assignments was not something to shout about. In the first 2 years of peace, the Americans shipped in 93,000 tons of tobacco to help get things back to normal. But Hitler's terrible legacy to Germany had this footnote. Nearly 50 years later, the number of German women dying of lung cancer was 4 times less than the rate among American women. This is a series about the remorseless progress of cancer from then until the present day, and how it reflects the priorities of each society it afflicts. It is a story about money and politics, about science, chance, and our collective ability to turn a blind eye to danger. It starts where Hitler ended, in the early days of peace. The war years had been good for the tobacco companies.
Why don't you settle back and have a full-flavored smoke? Settle back.
If anyone had read the articles published in Germany, they didn't take them seriously. Doctors had recommended smoking as an antidote to stress. Soldiers were given free cigarettes as part of their rations. Indirectly or directly, Smoking was associated with showbiz, sexual conquest, and glamour. The effect of this promotion was stark. Between 1940 and 1950, the number of people smoking in America nearly doubled. Back in Germany, it halved.
Pack or box.
One of the leading models at the time was a vivacious redhead called Janet Suckman. She became known as the Lucky Strike Girl. She still keeps mementos of her modelling days when it was de rigueur to be holding a cigarette, even when skiing.
Famous Lucky Strike, eh?
Cancer wasn't talked about much in those days. It was simply a nasty card fate sometimes dealt you. Evidence that it might be linked with smoking was never mentioned.
If I ever thought that you could get cancer from smoking, I wouldn't have touched cigarettes. And I smoked for 33 years. And had me hooked.
30 years later, she was told she had cancer of the throat. Her only hope was to have her larynx removed.
Let's count. 1, 2, 3.
It was a high price to pay, but one which many others of her generation have had to face as well. It took Janet 6 months to speak one word. She now passes on the skill to other victims of those days of carefree smoking.
And it was a matter of either having the operation to remove them or die, and there was no question what to do, so I had the operation.
Women had smoked much less than men before 1945, so the increase in their lung cancer figures after 1945 was much greater. Between then and 1980, they went up 7 times, while men's went up 4 times.
In this period, immediately after the war, cancer was basically something you died of. In public, doctors were determined to build on recent successes with smallpox and other infectious diseases.
With such great victories behind it, science turns to the most fearsome disease still threatening man.
But behind the facade, there was little practical hope. Few doctors relished a challenge that day by day they knew they were going to lose. Just starting in medical school was a young hopeful called Emil Freireich, who refused to accept that so little could be done.
How you doing today, Doc?
Good.
Good.
How are you doing is more important.
Dr. Freireich is now one of the top leukemia specialists in the world. But in the early 50s, he was just getting his basic medical training.
Oh, come back.
What astonished him was that cancer was scarcely on the syllabus.
And we can come back.
I can't recall a single lecture or a single professor discussing cancer during my entire undergraduate education. And as far as the public was concerned, cancer was not only a death penalty when you said you had cancer, but it was a disgrace.
In many ways, things had hardly progressed since the turn of the century. Surgery, when it was employed, was massive and traumatic. Radiation, a blunt instrument that often did as much harm as good.
Patients with cancer were really treated almost with disdain. People even thought that it was contagious. They didn't want to speak to you or be around you. No one could imagine anything constructive to do for these people. They just dwindled away. They starved to death. The doctors didn't want to have much to do with you because they don't like to face situations which are totally frustrating. This is not the kind of an environment a physician likes to practice in.
Cancer had been known about for hundreds of years, but it left the medical profession with an air of plaintive bewilderment.
Why should the cancer problem be so difficult? Why can't we find the reason? Why is it taking so long? Is there something in our daily work that stops it off? Science is examining every known suspect, samples collected from 100 places, breaking them down in an attempt to find the deadly factor.
One answer was that science and government had other priorities. These are the mountains of New Mexico, rich in uranium. In 1949, the Russians had exploded their first atomic weapon. The arms race was on, and uranium was essential. 4,000 Indians, mostly Navajo, worked down mines like this. Many died of lung cancer before they reached middle age. In publicity films, the men who mined the uranium were portrayed as patriots, working to build the bombs that would protect the free world. No mention was made of radon, a radioactive gas known to be released in the dusty process of mining.
Such mills must process hundreds of tons daily, for each ton of ore yields but a few pounds of uranium.
The leftover waste or tailings were buried under 3 feet of stones, but no proper study was carried out to assess whether that was effective protection. Just across the river from the old uranium mill lives Jimmy Godman. The river on which the Navajo and their cattle depend is now contaminated. Jimmy remembers how the dust blew from the mill into their house and how both his parents later grew ill.
I lived here for 35 years, I am. And my father and my mother died because of them tailings. They died from cancer.
His father always came home with dust on his clothes. Later he became weak and breathless. Eventually he was diagnosed with lung cancer. Then his mother grew ill as well. It was a painful death.
They came over and they said, hey, yeah, this is it. Say goodbye to your mother. This is, you know, we can't put no more drugs in her. This is it, it's final. They unplugged the cord and we all kind of stood around. It's awful watching a person die, especially your mother and your father.
Stuart Udall represented this region in Congress for 15 years. He was health secretary under 2 presidents, Kennedy and Johnson. As the nuclear industry expanded, he worried about the Navajo and repeatedly asked the nuclear scientists whether the mines were safe.
These were the great scientists. They had perfected the atomic bomb. They were producing these new sources of energy that would be the permanent source of energy for this planet. And they were very arrogant, and their attitudes were that they knew what was right, and they knew what they were doing, and it was safe. They would make it safe, and they had a right to mislead people, to lie. We were taken in by it because we didn't understand the science of it.
But working in Washington at the time was a formidable German emigre cancer expert who did understand the science of it. His name was William Hooper. He kept trying to warn the Atomic Energy Commission of the dangers he'd learned about in Europe and kept getting rebuffed.
Hooper was an explosive person, and he was very outspoken. He was furious. He said, well, we know. The European experience with this kind of mining has told us that there's going to be a terrible tragedy. And it's unconscionable for us not to take action now.
The Cold Warriors' counter-argument was that nothing should stand in the way of national security.
There was a solution: ventilate the mines. And this would have added to the cost of uranium 5% or 10%. That's the real tragedy, that there was a solution. There was a way to make mining safe, and that these people didn't need to be sacrificed.
Money before safety. Hooper had been a voice crying in the wilderness for years. Before the war, he'd alerted the chemical giant DuPont to the dangers of bladder cancer caused by industrial dyes. Mr. DuPont wrote back to say that he couldn't do anything about it because of the Depression.
It didn't help Huper's cause that much of his knowledge about the links between cancer and industry was based on pre-war German research. Black propagandists called him a Nazi. Years later, Robert Proctor came across the same evidence. Huper wasn't just guessing about the side effects of uranium mining.
This was something that raised a red flag. The Surgeon General said that this is simply no go. We're not going to have you publicizing this. Huper wanted to present a paper at the 1952 meeting of the Colorado Medical Society warning the miners there were going to be lung cancers, thousands and thousands of lung cancers. He was censored, his report was censored, and I really consider this the most dramatic example of state-sponsored medical censorship of our century in this country.
As so often, the politics of the moment dictated the action. In the 50s, fear of communism was far greater than fear of cancer. But in the early 60s, something happened which changed everything. This book became a #1 bestseller. Written by an unlikely revolutionary called Rachel Carson, The Silent Spring was a sustained polemic on the damage being inflicted on the environment by man. Her principal target was the chemical industry. Crop sprays like DDT, she said, were not only killing off wildlife, plants and fish, but having potentially disastrous effects on future generations as well. The industry retaliated with publicity stunts in which picnickers were sprayed with pesticide in apparent safety. Carson's warnings made her a target. "I thought she was a spinster," said one federal official. "What's she so worried about genetics for?" But unlike William Hooper, she was a public figure who couldn't be sidelined.
The reporter continued, "No one in either county farm office who was talked to today had read the book, but all disapproved of it heartily."
The attacks some of the people made on her, and some of these people were scientists who'd been hired by the chemical industry or the agribusiness industry, and they did get personal in their attacks, and it was very unfair.
Rachel Carson's secret was that she herself had breast cancer.
I don't think she fully realized in her lifetime the impact this book would have on the world, the whole world.
Only part of Rachel Carson's book had been about the effect of chemicals on humans and the possible link with cancer. But what this one woman did was cause a sea change in public awareness, and that meant the politicians had to change their tune as well.
The World Health Organization estimates there are 3 million cases of pesticide poisonings each year, causing about 220,000 deaths worldwide. No one knows how many cancers may be caused by these exposures.
In Britain, as in America, tobacco was still fun. Although the number of people with lung cancer, particularly men, showed a sharp increase in the 50s, no one pinned the blame on cigarettes. Working in Oxford University at the time was another prophet to whom no one would listen. In due course, he would become one of the most famous names in the war against cancer. But then Richard Doll was just an epidemiologist, curious about the alarming rise in lung cancers. Like most scientists, he and his team were totally unaware of the Nazi research done during the war.
We drew up a list of everything we could think of that might have caused an increase, and smoking was one of those things, so it wasn't a factor which I thought was at all likely. It was such a common thing. It's been going on for so long. I thought it was much more likely something to do with motor cars.
I mean, if you go into your garage and shut your garage door and you sit in the car with your car running, you'll be dead in about, what, 10 minutes, quarter of an hour? And yet there's millions of motor vehicles on the road pouring this out all day long. Does that have anything to do with cancer of the lung?
It sounded a plausible theory. Winter smogs in London caused the death of thousands of asthmatics. But on close examination, it didn't satisfy Dole and his team.
Well, we never found any relationship with motor fumes at all. That's to say, looking at people that spent most of their time on the roads, like traffic policemen, for example, or drivers of vehicles, we found that they didn't have any increased risk of lung cancer. Whereas the smoking difference was enormous.
Dole then checked around the world to see if the countries that smoked the most had the most cancer. They did. But what seemed an obvious conclusion to Dole was greeted with a shrug of indifference when it was first published in 1952. Guy Scadding, a leading chest surgeon who was seeing an increasing amount of lung cancer, wrote to the Times in an effort to get some publicity. The Times refused to publish his letters, and when he wrote back to complain, they fobbed him off with the usual excuses. It was very interesting, but they had heavy commitments to other stories, lack of space and so on.
I think the reason the Times didn't publish our letters was just the financial stranglehold that the tobacco industry has on the press.
Whenever there was a scientific statement about the harmful effects of smoking, there would be another statement by Dr. X saying that this was not proved. So it was hardly surprising that the public didn't take it particularly seriously. Experts disagree, and that, of course, was the tobacco industry's policy, to make it appear that experts disagreed.
I don't think people should go up smoking until they can prove it definitely that it is the cause of cancer. And I don't believe that at the moment.
The problem was, smoking was fashionable. The king was one of millions who smoked heavily, and few people saw any connection between that and his recent death from lung cancer. Dole decided to conduct a survey of the very people who were meant to be setting an example, the doctors in Britain's famous National Health Service.
In less than 5 years, they had got evidence that doctors who smoked were dying much more frequently of lung cancer than doctors who didn't smoke.
In 1962, the year Rachel Carson's book was published in America, the Royal College of Physicians were persuaded to endorse Dole's work with a report of their own. This time, people did notice.
Ladies and gentlemen, our sole purpose and function is to help you to give up smoking. You are here because you've failed.
For a while, the new message had some effect. Smokers were offered the deterrent of staring at a cancerous lung. But the fashion didn't last. In hospitals, lab technicians and doctors continued to smoke. The director of a famous cancer research institute decreed that his staff could smoke, provided they weren't in the lab, which was overlooked by double-decker buses passing in the street outside. The real battlefield was 3,000 miles away in the southern states of America.
This is the land where tobacco is grown. State of North Carolina, USA.
Tobacco farmers had helped America grow rich. They were as much part of the nation's history as cowboys and Cadillacs.
This is my farm, and that's my house. Lived in it all my life. Got married in it, gonna die in it.
Tobacco was important to the economy of at least 16 American states. It also made a major contribution to the federal budget.
At that time, the tobacco industry had an inordinate amount of influence in Congress, had and still has an inordinate amount of money to spend, and many politicians, particularly those who came from the South or who depended upon support from the South, pretty much had to play that game.
But some in Washington knew the British evidence couldn't be ignored. Under the tightest security, a committee of doctors was asked to make its own report. Working underground in the National Medical Archives, they were forbidden to talk to outsiders. Everyone knew how much depended on their findings. Smoking consumption in America was then around 4,000 cigarettes per adult per year. On the committee staff was a man named Don Shopland.
You could just tell from the sense of the people that they were sort of embarking upon something that was very important from the standpoint of a major public event that was about to unfold. And as we got closer and closer to releasing the report, the stress and the tension just seemed to multiply, and you could just sort of feel it.
To avoid the charge of bias, the high-powered committee selected by the Surgeon General was a careful balance of smokers and non-smokers. One of them was a young hospital doctor called Charles LeMaitre.
Being the youngest member of this committee, I was in awe of the other members. The effect on the stock market was something that everybody questioned as to what would happen if the report came out with an adverse set of recommendations.
The tobacco companies were invited to submit evidence to the committee. Behind the scenes, they were in turmoil. Unknown to outsiders, they had just completed laboratory experiments on rats, which indicated that nicotine was addictive. But they decided it would be inappropriate to include it in their submissions to the Surgeon General's committee. In other words, they suppressed it.
They had extensive scientific evidence showing addiction in animals, showing addiction in humans, and they were now concentrating at the time the report was going on how to sustain that need caused by the addiction in terms of the number of cigarettes used. In other words, they were using it to their advantage in marketing cigarettes.
The job of filing all the research papers that were sent to the committee was done by Don Shopland. He confirms that none of this information about nicotine's addictive properties was submitted by the tobacco industry.
I can tell you from having been the keeper of those files, there was no papers that showed that there was any causal association between smoking and any disease, not just lung cancer, and there was certainly no information that addressed the addictive potential of nicotine. Absolutely none.
After weeks of deliberation, the Surgeon General's report was eventually made public in April 1964. To prevent last-minute leaks, journalists and committee members alike were locked into the press room while the findings were read out.
It is the judgment of the committee that cigarette smoking contributes substantially to mortality from certain specific diseases and to the overall death rate.
Tobacco company men were soon on their feet with an answer.
The further fact is that this report does not specify any substance in tobacco smoke that would account for causing a disease. The fundamental question remains, what causes cancer?
It was not the time to take on the tobacco growers in the South. There were enough problems down there already. President Johnson was already battling to force the South to accept civil rights legislation. A tobacco war he could do without. One of his aides was Joseph Califano.
We were riding around the ranch. I'm sitting with this big briefing book in my lap and smoking. And I said to the president, here's a proposal to ban cigarette advertising from television. And Johnson turned to me and he said, the day you quit smoking is the day I'll send that proposal to Congress. Of course, I never quit smoking while I was working for him. I was smoking 4 packs of cigarettes a day. The reason why the president did not go after tobacco was because we were at war with the South on civil rights. We were at war in Virginia. We were at war in Kentucky. We were at war in North Carolina, pressing civil rights legislation. And the president was not about to take on tobacco.
Action on smoking in the house. Can I help you?
Johnson's reluctance to move against tobacco led to the foundation of the world's most effective anti-smoking lobby.
File papers tomorrow?
John Barnsup, who now runs it, was then a young lawyer. He remembers how it all began.
Okay, I think we can do it.
One Thanksgiving day, I was sitting around watching a lot of American football games. They tend to be clustered on Thanksgiving. And I noticed, as everybody else did, a whole slew of cigarette commercials. They were the most widely advertised product on TV at the time.
Out for a walk with my dog one day when a gal and her pup strolled my way. Her pooch liked mine, and we started to talk. First thing you know, we started to walk. We reached for cigarettes. I said, try mine.
It wasn't just that the ads carried no warning in those days. They still associated cigarettes with well-being and good health.
I want you folks out there to note that when Jesse Owens smokes a cigarette, he smokes Chesterfield. That's usually true of sport figures, whether they're champions like Jesse or people like you and me who do a bit of bowling now and then.
John Barnes-Up then remembered something called the fairness doctrine, which stated that any broadcaster who gave airtime to a controversial view must also allow time for the opposite point of view to be put as well. He decided to write to the Federal Communications Commission, claiming his right. It didn't do much for his prospects at the law firm.
When I came in Monday morning, the senior partner asked to see me. I had never met him before. And I'll never forget, I walked into his office. He said, John, do you know who our major client is? I said, no. He said, it's Philip Morris. He said, John, do you know who owns the very building we're in? I said, no. He said, the answer is Philip Morris. And he then went on to explain to me that in this situation, pursuing any kind of activity which was harmful to the tobacco industry, put it mildly, wouldn't help my chances of making partner in the future.
The FCC said the principal was right, but they couldn't do anything about it unless a broadcaster had actually turned him down. So Barnes-Up wrote to CBS in New York and asked for time to put the case against smoking. As expected, they refused. So he wrote back to the FCC and asked them to order CBS to comply. It worked.
Tony Curtis, congratulating people who've quit smoking. Congratulations. I quit. Cigarettes, that is.
Before long, anti-smoking advertisements like this were running on American television. A freshly qualified young lawyer, working virtually single-handed, had landed the first significant blow on the tobacco company.
We figured you'd be here.
Cigarettes. They're killers.
I was having people come up to me in the street, said, I saw these messages. I quit smoking. Or more usually, my kid badgered me into quitting smoking. We soon had figures showing that literally tens of thousands, millions of Americans were quitting smoking as a result of this.
You want to make your mama really proud? Quit smoking.
It is a matter of record, then, that the tobacco industry went to the United States Congress in the fall of 1969 and said, we want to get off the air. We don't want to advertise anymore. This is killing us.
The trouble was, the fairness doctrine didn't apply to magazines.
The week after cigarette advertisements were banned on television, 10 pages of Life magazine were filled with them. The amount of money spent on advertising actually went up by $2 billion. Smoking fell by 11% in the first 6 months after the ban, then picked up to its previous level.
The war on cancer itself was slowly gathering momentum. One significant impetus was the tragedy of all the children who contracted leukemia. None survived.
I particularly remember my first night on call when a helicopter brought a 2-year-old boy to the intensive care unit because he was bleeding at the same time from many different places. He looked like a human pincushion. I stayed up all night with that boy. Had to stick him many, many times, putting needles and catheters in him. And the next day we did a bone marrow to confirm that he had leukemia. Jimmy died within a couple of months, but that's what we expected.
Just outside Washington is the heartland of government-funded medical research in America. In 1955, the National Cancer Institute opened a new center which began to attract some of the best young medical brains in the country.
My professor calls me to his office and said, Dr. Freireich, have you ever heard of a place called the National Institutes of Health? No, sir. Well, there is this building, and I'm in charge of it, and I'm recruiting young physicians, so I want you to go look at this building and see if you would like to work there. What we found was really astonishing. Here in Bethesda, a suburb of Washington, beautiful Maryland countryside, is this campus with this enormous hospital. All the equipment, space, beds, resources, personnel you could want. Unlimited resources, unlimited opportunity, unfettered freedom to do what your mind tells you to do.
The doctors in Freirecht's group set themselves the target of curing childhood leukemia. Few youngsters who got it lived more than 2 years after diagnosis.
The academic community was very negative about it. They viewed us as a bunch of idealists who were, impractical and thinking of weird things. When actually I, along with a group of people working with me at the Cancer Institute, proposed that leukemia in children could be cured, it was treated with equal disdain.
During the war, scientists had experimented with powerful new drugs which opened the door on a new treatment known as chemotherapy, literally treating with chemicals. Following these early pioneers, Freirecht now found that in some combinations, the drugs did appear to put the leukemia into remission.
The problem was that all the children in remission who seemed to be free of disease and evidently cured had their disease come back.
The doctors knew the drugs could kill the children, but they now decided to keep the dose going even when the children were in remission, that is to say, apparently healthy.
When we started these studies, everybody knew they were risky. We were going to treat people in remission. Now, the side effects could be terrible. They could have died from the treatment. So there was enormous tension in the unit.
The highly toxic drugs were given to 20 children, and the team waited nervously for the results.
Fortunately, none of the first 20 died. Some of them got pretty sick and very close to the brink, but they all survived, and then they were doing well. And now the mood was one not of fear and terror, but the mood was, what could it be? Could it be that these children really are not going to die?
Hi, Perla. How are you doing this morning?
It was a moment of hope, but as so often in this war, far from a victory. More than half the children they treated still did not survive. And some of them, as Archie Blyer recalls, developed complications that were even worse than the original disease.
What happened then was not expected. Instead of the leukemia coming back in the bone marrow and blood, where it started, it became to be common to have it come back in the central nervous system. That is, in the brain, the spinal cord, and the coverings around the brain and spinal cord. Then came Dr. Pinkel.
Donald Pinkel joined the fight against childhood leukemia after 10 years in the U.S. Navy. His unflinching resolve through all the hazards of experimental medicine would eventually earn him the title Mr. Leukemia.
I'm by nature an optimist, and I was convinced there would be a cure for these children, and it was my responsibility to find it.
He took on the worst leukemia cases of all, where chemotherapy had failed and the cancer was destroying the children's central nervous system.
Sorry, John. It was very sad because here were these youngsters who were destined to die, unfortunately, whose last months were a neurological nightmare, not just for the child, but for the family.
His radical answer was to try radiation. Although radiation had been used to treat tumors for decades, the idea of using it on the brains of young children startled many doctors. The one certainty was that the children would die anyway. So Pinkel went ahead without even knowing what dose to give. He started with 500 rands.
That didn't work. So we went up higher, and we went up to 1,200 rads.
But that didn't work either, despite giving radiation to the whole brain and the entire spinal cord. Those children still developed central nervous system leukemia. And then, despite many objections throughout the country, including his own hospital, he tried a higher dose.
And we increased our dose of radiation to the cranium to 2,400 rad. 1/2 of the original group that we treated from December 67 until June of 68 are still surviving free of leukemia. So it worked. It was exhilarating, just like a roller coaster, in that you felt that you were moving ahead and you were making a difference. And that's what most of us want to do, is make a difference.
But it was not matched by successes in many other fields. As cancer deaths continued to rise, pressure grew for government to do something about it.
Every year there are 200,000 cases of childhood cancer in the developed world. Most are leukemia cases. Once they would all have died, now 80% survive.
In 1969, America sent a rocket to the moon with 3 men on board. It was a moment of huge optimism and national pride.
Dark clear, 13 seconds.
If science and money could do that, science and money could do virtually anything. From the moon, the astronauts spoke by phone to President Richard Nixon.
Go ahead, Mr. President. This is Houston out.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. And this certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made.
But Nixon knew it was really Jack Kennedy's vision they were applauding. He wanted his own triumph, and there was a woman in Washington with a clear idea of what it should be. The mood of can-do optimism that engulfed America after the moon landing was tailor-made for one of the most skillful fundraisers and lobbyists ever to work the corridors of power. Mary Lasker was the supreme political hostess. Rich, charming, well-connected, persuasive. She had a burning ambition to advance the cause of cancer research.
Mary Lasker was a magical woman. I first knew her when she was in her mid-70s, and she was beautiful, always well-dressed, and she just imparted this incredible sense of energy and a passion to do things.
Friends like Jordan Guterman say Lasker's horror of cancer dated back to a visit she made as a girl to her mother's laundress in Wisconsin.
They came upon this small house, and Mrs. Belter, the laundress, was actually changing into a blouse, and she noticed that she had no breasts. She had had bilateral mastectomies. And this horrified this young girl, Mary Lasker, and she just couldn't understand it. And somewhere in her teenage years, actually, she resolved that if she ever had the resources, she would commit her life to doing something for cancer and for other diseases. Often, she said, the doctors would say there's nothing to do, it's an act of God, and she just wouldn't accept this.
The grown-up Mary Lasker married a rich advertising executive and launched herself into party giving for good causes. When Johnson had been president, she'd known all the top Democrats.
Mary Lasker was a friend of my mother's. I remember the great respect my mother had for her, and she was a great friend of my sister Eunice's as well. Didn't make any difference if they were Democrat or Republican. They were right on this issue. She went to bat for them, and everyone had such enormous respect for her, they understood.
It is necessary to have people like Mary Lasker because politicians are people like all of us. They don't know any more about cancer than the average citizen. They have to be educated. They have to be convinced. They have to understand. They have to calculate cost-benefit. And you need people to tell them.
Her skill was to bring scientists into contact with politicians and let them do the talking.
She would always have scientists who were able to communicate in a language that was comprehensible.
In this situation, she would try to illustrate what we're actually doing in science, what needs to be done. If we can only clone this particular gene or do this and such, or a clinical scientist who's saying, we're beginning to work with this compound in cancer, but we really need big money for this.
Big money meant getting a cancer bill through Congress. Most days, she would travel down from New York to Washington to work the system. Her ambition was to see a special cancer agency, rather like the moonshot agency NASA, that would lead the drive for a cure. Mary Lasker knew better than anyone how to pitch a case on Capitol Hill.
You only had a few minutes with each of these people. The bells would be ringing for a vote, or calls would come in. And she would always say, now, Jordan, we may have 3 minutes. He's got his mind on 24 other things. So we've got to hit him hard.
What she capitalized on was the growing anxiety about cancer. Action on Cancer was a vote winner, and the two political heavyweights of the day, Richard Nixon and Edward Kennedy, both wanted votes. So by the end of 1970, there was little doubt there would be a new Cancer Act. The question was, would it be Nixon or Kennedy?
It wasn't a cakewalk. And it took a good deal of time and also some political workings as well. I think the president Nixon wanted to make sure that it was his initiative and that he had his stamp on it.
But Kennedy, with a majority in the Senate behind him, was making the running. Then Nixon went to the Hill for his State of the Union address.
The time has come in America when the same kind of concentrated effort that split the atom and took man to the moon should be turned toward conquering this dread disease. I will ask for an appropriation of an extra $100 million to launch an intensive campaign to find a cure for cancer, and I will ask later for whatever additional funds can effectively be used.
Nearly a year of political maneuvering followed. In the end, Lasker didn't get her NASA-style cancer agency. But she did get big money. To make this happen, Kennedy had had to remove his name from the bill.
It was brought to my attention that we would make more progress in getting the legislation out if my name and was not on it.
How are you?
In December 1971, the main players gathered in the Oval Office to witness the signing of the bill, minus Kennedy's name. It was said that Nixon had had to be coerced into letting cameras film the ceremony in case his rival stole his triumph.
The House and Senate, who are members of the committee back here, shows how deep...
Nixon asked for a cure for cancer in time for the nation's bicentenary, a 5-year target to match Jack Kennedy's Men on the Moon in 10.
We don't have to tell House and Senate members how to get in the picture, don't we? We are here today for the purpose of signing the Cancer Act of 1971. And I hope that in the years ahead, that we may look back on this day and this action as being the most significant action taken during this administration. It could be, because when we consider what cancer does each year in the United States, we find that more people each year die of cancer in the United States than all the Americans who lost their lives in World War II.
The war on cancer terms, the conquest of cancer, overcoming cancer, a cure by 1976, these were never things said by scientists. These were things said by politicians.
Nonetheless, the Cancer Act showed how far public attitudes had changed in 20 years. The Act committed $2.5 million a year for cancer research. From being the disease which people shunned or ignored, cancer had shot to the top of the political agenda.
We would not want to raise false hopes by simply the signing of an act. But we can say this, that for those who have cancer and who are looking for success in this field, they at least can have the assurance that everything that can be done by government Everything that can be done by voluntary agencies in this great, powerful, rich country now will be done.
It was an extraordinary irony. It was just 4 weeks after we passed that cancer that my son, Teddy, had a bruise that he thought was a bruise on his knee. That was the day we found out that he had bone cancer, an osteosarcoma that had penetrated very deeply into his whole knee joint, and it was immediately apparent that he was going to have his leg amputated. You know, there's very few people whose lives haven't been touched by cancer.
Kennedy's son was cured, and children with leukemia started to survive. But the years which followed the 1971 Cancer Act were characterized more by frustration than success. The outlook for most other cancers showed no change at all. This child, 27 years later, has a brain tumor that cannot be removed.
One of the things we've learned is that unlimited resources is not sufficient to solve all human problems. If we spent the entire gross national product on curing cancer, it's not assured that it would happen. If you simplify the cancer problem and say we're going to lick it, I think it's too simple. It's not lickable in the usual sense, but it is controllable.
The frontline troops of the war ahead would be the patients themselves.
Can you tell me what Papa? Oh, I'm sleeping, huh?
One of them was a child who'd been through weeks of pain as doctors tried in vain to save his life. Archie Blyer remembers how that dying child tried to reassure him.
It happened one night when I was on call, and after doing my rounds late in the evening, saying goodnight to one boy that I had been taking care of for about 8 months, who was in the hospital because of a problem I couldn't quite figure out. And one of the reasons why I couldn't figure it out is because he never talked to me during those 8 months that I was treating him. He would talk to his mother and father, and they would relate to me what he wanted me to know. But he could not talk to me. I said goodnight to Scotty. I went to my on-call room, and about 4 o'clock in the morning, the nurse said, "Scotty wants to see you." I approached his room, not knowing what to expect. And after some pause, Scotty talked to me. He wanted me to know that he appreciated what I was trying to do for him. I said thank you after talking with him for a while. Went back to my room, and 2 hours later, the nurse called to say he had died, even before his parents could come back to the room. He died of leukemia, but he let me know that this was the right thing to do.